a dialogue with somebody recently, and I just want to kind of clarify some things. They had said that it was difficult for them to tell the difference between socialization and indoctrination, and I guess naively took them to be saying that they really didn't understand the difference and would like that clarified, but in reality it was a passive-aggressive rhetorical question meant to assert that there is no difference. Like, rather than saying there is no difference, the person was pretending to ask what the difference is, but really it was, like I say, rhetorical assertion. But there is a difference, and there was one point in the conversation where I asked a friend of mine who has studied social anthropology and also linguistics, and I said, "Could you come and look at this thread and see what it is I'm not communicating, because I'm having difficulty understanding what it is that I'm saying that's hard to understand, and they're not understanding it, they're not." And so he came and kind of did a review of the thread, and then he kind of posted a clarification. And the one thing that he did say that I said, well, I would be willing to kind of, I guess, adopt that perspective, was he was like, well, it's possible that what the person is saying is that indoctrination is a form of socialization that is like an unhealthy form of socialization. And I said, well, I would certainly be amenable to that. I mean, if somebody wants to say socialization is, healthy structuring of like a person to help them be successful in the society, that's, I was arguing that it was different than the unhealthy indoctrination that happens when you try to coercively force someone to believe certain things. But what he was saying is that you could probably look at it under a broad umbrella of socialization and then say that this was just a very bad form of socialization. Yeah. And if that's, I was like, well, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But of course, this turned out did not be what the other person was asserting. They were just simply asserting, no, there's no difference.
To me, kind of strikes me as odd, because it's kind of like saying there's no difference between teaching and indoctrinating.
Well, there are people that say there's no difference between education and indoctrination. I've heard that before, too. I compared it to the difference between parenting and abusing a child. And I said, when you talk about parenting, you could say, I suppose, that abusing your kid is a form of parenting that is like a really crappy form of parenting. You know what I mean? It's like a bad form of parenting. And one of the things they were talking about in this dialogue was that religion does good things too, even though it does bad things. And I was like, well, abusive parents. You could be sexually abusing your child and buy them presents and feed them well, which, feeding them well and buying them gifts would be nice. But you could still be abusing them, which is not good, And so you can be a good parent and do good things for your child and not abuse them. And you can be an abusive parent and also do some good things for your kid. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no difference between healthy parenting and abuse, just because there might be some things in common there and just because there may be some similarly expressed goals. But the idea of socialization, when you say someone is not well socialized, or when you're trying to help somebody to re-socialize into an environment, usually that is viewed as beneficial to the person in a way that isn't forced or coerced. You're trying to actually help them be successful by simply teaching them to get along. So, for example, if I were going to travel to another country where they had some different rules of etiquette or different rules of how they eat or things that were polite or not polite, I would make an attempt to learn those things so that I don't inadvertently offend somebody in the culture, that I know how to eat with chopsticks, for example, if I was going to go somewhere where I might not find a knife and fork, readily available. None of this would be stuff that would be coerced on me. If I went to learn the language, for example, if I was going to Japan and I went and took some classes on, basic Japanese for communication purposes, just general conversational Japanese, those would be things that would be helping me to socialize, helping me to get in there and be able to be somewhat successful as a visitor in that country or as a tourist in that country. There would be nothing about learning the language, learning the customs. None of that would require someone to coerce me or convince me that it was better to do it this way than this other way. There'd be nothing in there that would be threatening to me, they wouldn't say it's just an authoritarian mandate and you have to do it because this is the way you do it. Yeah. It's like, yes, this is the way they do it there. You're not going to be arrested if you pull out a plastic fork. You can do it differently. They'll just see it as weird. But no, they're not going to, do anything horrible to you for deviating from these just like customary things. It's just be considered odd. It might be considered rude, but in general, these are just social things. Now, there are times when healthy socialization would result in coercion, but it wouldn't be like so much a mental coercion. It would be, for example, if someone were murdering other citizens, we would coerce that person. We would literally lock them into an involuntary, state of captivity. We wouldn't which wouldn't necessarily result in changing their beliefs or their ideas about how they treat other people. It would just get them out of the mix. So
if you can't stop killing people, we'll put you in a position where you can.
Now, I will say that, repeatedly in this dialogue, the person kept telling me, that indoctrination can happen outside of religion, and I'd never, ever denied that. I never once said that that's not true. And in fact, I said I agreed that there are examples, within probably most cultures that you can find something that is amenable to, or that is lends itself to propaganda, which would be like dishonest distortion of information in order to try to sway people to think a different way. You can find situations where, people might grow up, like, for example, we have people that are in our society that would be racist, that would probably raise their children and trying to indoctrinate them into racism, that would, teach them sort of hateful things and teach them to not think about it, to just accept that we're better than this group over here, and they are not as good, and there would be lots of, authoritarianism with that. There's not a lot of reasoning with the person to get them to believe this.
I think there's an example. Well, first of all, you've got socialization, you have indoctrination, and indoctrination can, of course, occur outside of religion, but I'm not even sure that we can even say that all indoctrination is necessarily bad. Now, if we're going to define it that way, I would say that certain aspects of the time I spent in boot camp were indoctrination more than just socialization and instruction. There is a process of mental breakdown that does, and I was wondering earlier how much of this goes to like the religion cult line, where you draw that line. And there's parts of that work that way.
Yeah, but I would say that when you can identify threads of authoritarianism that are basically like, when you ask a question, you're just told that's how it is, and that's the answer, you may be looking at indoctrination. And if people are being coerced, when you hear things like, if you don't believe this, all these horrible things will happen, this is so much better than this other thing, and there's no real reasons being given. It's not really explained in a way that is amenable to questioning. And if you question it, that's, I think, what I'm talking about. The coercion comes along when people start to question. So when coercion is used to keep you from thinking and questioning, when authoritarianism is used as the answer and the explanation for why you have to accept these things, you're looking at something that goes beyond just the requirements of socializing a person. That's more than teaching you to use a knife and fork. That's more than teaching you the language. That's more than teaching you to shake hands and hold a door for someone.
And these things may be different at different ages as well.
Sure.
So if you're talking about young children who aren't necessarily acting of their own volition and aren't of an age where they can consent and understand and all these other things, you may be engaged in indoctrinating.
Right, people communicate. Their communication psychology changes throughout their lives, and when you're little, you have what's called black and white thinking. What I find is that people that are into environments that are heavily indoctrinal, they tend to carry this black and white thinking into adulthood. They don't ever outgrow this. We're supposed to grow it out at a very young age. You're supposed to outgrow this, but some people keep going with this into adulthood. Black and white thinking is that, it's good or bad. And yes, you use that with like a very tiny child who has not developed like the cognitive psychology that's required to assess a situation. So for example, the hot stove to a very small child, you're going to present that stove or an iron as simply hot and dangerous and bad. And you don't really, the child doesn't need to really understand how or why or when it's bad, because later on when he gets old enough to grasp that it can be hot sometimes, it's not hot all the time, then he can kind of begin to police himself about when he touches the stove, doesn't touch the stove. But when he's really tiny, you just don't want him to ever touch it, right? Because he can't assess it, and you don't want him. You want him to kind of fear the stove, fear the iron. Don't go near it because it could really hurt you if you go over there at the wrong time and touch that thing.
Stove bad.
Yeah, it's bad. It's hot. Usually that's what we teach them. Hot, hot, burn you. And the kid is like, ooh. You'll hear the little children repeat that, like, ooh, hot. So they understand that hot is not good. As soon as a child burns himself and understands hot.
And later on, they learn that hot is good.
But anyway, that was kind of what I wanted to get at, was the idea that, you could, if you want to call it socialization, that's fine, but please differentiate between the idea of merely socializing and socializing in a way that is actually harmful, that impedes critical thinking, that discourages questioning, discourages expression of doubt, that even threatens and coerces, to avoid, and also it's about thought control too. That's important because, like I said, locking someone in a cage is not indoctrination. Indoctrination is when you get them to lock themselves in a cage mentally. That's what your goal is when you indoctrinate a person, is getting them to stop asking by them on their own. And so anyway, it's not that difficult. I agree there's probably gray areas of things that you could come up with, like a lot of gray areas, and I understand that. But basically, there's gray areas too when it gets into, is something okay or not okay to do to a child if you're a parent. You can have gray areas where people will argue back and forth. Is this abuse? Is this okay? Is this wrong? Is this harmful? How harmful is it? Is it okay to do something if it's beneficial but it might be a little harmful? I mean, you get these gray areas, but in the end, if somebody's child ends up dead in a hospital because they beat it to death, that's abuse, and it's not healthy parenting. And so to say that because you can sometimes find these gray areas in between, that we don't have any metric for abuse is completely wrong.
And we hear that type of thing. The thing
All
is,
the time.
we're bad. We are bad at distinguishing things on a spectrum.
Yeah, black and white thinking.
So it's easy to go for the extremes, and it's much more difficult to sort out the things in the middle. Where is that exact line? Well, there is no exact line. There's not necessarily an exact line between socialization and indoctrination, between gay and straight, which is already a mess by putting those labels on it anyway, but between religions and cults. Well, religions are all cults. Yes, under one understanding of cult, they're all cults, but under the normative, the psychological definition of cult, there's a slight difference there. And so, Joe Bob down the street who just loves Jesus and doesn't really, get bothered by a lot of things, probably isn't part of a cult. Especially the people, anybody who's praying for their football team today, probably not in a cult. Because you probably aren't taking your religion.
Well, the other thing too, though, is there are some religious, religious groups that don't really threaten.
Yeah.
That don't threaten you. You can adopt them or not adopt them. I mean.
Whatever.
Yeah.
You believe what you believe.
So not all religions are indoctrinating people, and not all groups that indoctrinate people are religions. But that doesn't mean that socialization and indoctrination are the equivalent of one another.